the Electric Light and Power Act. This was an act that was passed, as was said by, I believe, Senator Walters in his presentation in 2013, being ushered in under the last administration and sought to repeal and replace a piece of legislation that was there from the 1800s, late 1800s. And one of the first observations that he would make was that in 2013, when this act repealed and replaced the previous piece of legislation, it made provision for the generation of electricity. And that permeates through the entirety of the legislation. It made no provision at all for storage. It made no provision for transmission and distribution of electricity. And when you hear any of the criticisms of the normal Barbadians who would have invested in solar technology, complaining that they have invested in solar panels on their homes, and they thought that they would be able to sell electricity to Barbados Light and Power and then be making a return because they don't have to pay any electrical bills, and then there's a fuel adjustment charge, and then how is it that they're now supplying electricity to Barbados Light and Power on the grid, but they're still having a bill where they have to pay. The whole thing was sold to them as bringing certain returns. And I think all of that discussion has to go back to the framing of legislation and the framing of policy. You see, the simplistic distinction that Barbados is a society and not an economy, or that we can distinguish between the two, or we can separate them out and have an economy over here and a society over here, seems to be coming back. Because when I was in this place, like Senator Parris who was, and Sir, you were in the other place, we heard a lot of that discussion. And it seemed to me that what my good friend Senator Walters was trying to frame was a discussion that asked certain pertinent questions that Barbadians are asking. But I fear that that is an oversimplification of a very important issue at stake. When this current legislative framework was put in place, the Barbados Light and Power license was extended to 2020. The government of the day chose to put a legislative framework in place that essentially did not match the economic reality, because renewable energy didn't just turn on in May 2018 when the Barbados Labour Party was voted into office. Professor, I can't remember his name, Oliver Helly. I was going to refer to him by his sweet baritone voice in the university choir. But years ago, when I was a student at university, gave the Sir Winston Scott Memorial Lecture saying when the oil runs out, the sun will still be here. So that to try to make it sound that this was a political soundbite in a campaign that Barbadians were hooked onto, and then somehow hoodwinked into going to the banks and borrowing money, and it is unfortunate. This country has had a long investment in renewable energy from the time of the 1970s and 80s for solar water heaters and down the road. And Barbadians understand that Bajans who have electric cars or hybrids understand the savings that they have made in relation to renewable energy and alternative sources from fossil fuels, fueling how they go about their daily lives. But this legislation was passed in 2013. And the reason why government has sought to bring a more comprehensive bill, and you hear criticisms elsewhere that the government is rushing this legislation. For a long time, I heard the discussion from this corner to the leader of government business. When is the government going to bring the legislation that it is working on or it had promised? And now the legislation has come, we're hearing that it's being rushed. And it is unfair to those persons who have worked assiduously on bringing a more comprehensive regime. And when I say this, the Electric Light and Power Act is a day late and $1 short when it was passed in 2013. because the license given to the Barbados Light and Power to extend up to 2028. That was what the license was for. But it made no provision for storage of electricity. Are you building out a renewable energy sector and people investing in solar? But at the time, this technology was now setting its way in the world, and we felt that solar panels would give us access to electricity. But at the time, no one really thought about the question about storage. No one thought about the question of distribution and transmission. But by 2013, these were things. And when we look at the legislation, this bill, and it is not a knock on the last administration. By no means am I trying to do that, because this was fit for the time. But at the same time, when we look at it, the supplier of electricity was given a license to extend. So who was this legislation intended to capture? There was no other player coming into the market to provide electricity, to generate it. Yes, it was liberalized. The market was liberalized in law. But in fact, it was not, because the solar uptake that we have in the country was predicated on a different arrangement. And what you have where the grid is filled, I can't use the technical terms like the minister, you have the grid being filled up, and there's no more capacity that the grid can take. The regulatory regime now has to be set by a certain legislative framework, which this Electrical Supply Act purports to do. And I want to bring to the attention of the Chamber, Mr. President, what I consider to be the fundamental ethos which is different in the framework. When you look at the two and you put them side by side and align them, from the very beginning of the act, you see the distinctions that are being made. And I think a lot of the time we want to just speak to the bread and butter issues. Is this bill going to bring cheaper electricity to my home? But the world does not work like that. And if we try to make Barbadians feel that we can create a piece of legislation that will automatically bring you less light bills in October, then we are not really understanding the complexities of the modern world that we live in. A lot of variables have to be put in place. And I liken that discussion of the right excellent Errol Walton Barrow when he spoke about the national debt and taking advantage of ordinary people and their expectations and heightening them to certain levels. Sir, this bill that we have to consider speaks for the first time to an electricity system for the generation, storage, transmission, distribution, and dispatch of electricity. This goes beyond the concept of just generation alone. And I want to keep it simple, because when the Electric Light and Power Act was passed in 2013, they were talking about generation of electricity. But we only had one major supplier, entity generating electricity. So while you were purporting a law to liberalize the sector, in reality, what were you doing? You were not providing for the capacity of the sector to build in its natural way. Sir, I have heard some criticism about the constant references of the minister in the process. And I accept Senator Malilu's genuine point. What happens when we have a minister that's not reasonable? And that is a valid criticism. But I look at it in a different way. I know, because I take these things a little more seriously as a lawyer. The word minister in here does not mean the minister of energy, even although the bill says minister shall mean the minister of energy. No minister by themselves runs the ministry. And perhaps, I'm sorry that Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers is not in the seat, because we sat on the Constitutional Reform Commission, and I am not going to bring tales out of Scooby. We will lay our report on Monday before Her Excellency the President. But one of the things that we have not done well in this country is to deconstruct a lot of the systems that we have created. Now, we have adopted the English formulation or the British formulation of the minister must do this and the minister must do that. So when the leader of the government, Mrs. said today that she was instructed in the Carltona principles, what does that mean? It means that the minister acts through the agencies of his or her ministry. And it's understood that the minister, when referred to in legislation, is not exercising a personal power, but this power can be lawfully exercised through the ministry. And it begs the question, when you evaluate the extensive amount of work that is required to manage this supply of electricity under the legislation, whether or not we ought not have been creating an authority and giving them the expertise. I'm not saying that the civil servants cannot do this work, because we received a briefing from experts within the ministry, persons that I know who I went to university with, who are well versed in these areas. But I am sure that the technical capacity for the management and administration of this, as the minister said, we're now trying to outfit other agencies of government. But the point I really want to make is, have we not come to the stage where in Barbados that we need to move beyond the British formulations of the structures of government to create autonomous departments that the government can rely on in relation to advising on policy at the national level, where the competency is there, where the minister can bring to cabinet objective, qualified, and verified information about the status of the sector, and that information is shared with the parliament so that there can be some accountability as to how government is run and functioning, so that while the criticism is that the minister shall develop and direct the planning, development, and monitoring of the electrical system, I understand the criticism that the minister now might be competent, that there may be no minister that reaches that level of competency in the future. In fact, you might find a situation where in the last two administrations of the DLP, there was not even a Ministry of Energy, but it formed part of a division within the Ministry of Finance, so that there was no day-to-day ministerial direction on energy policy, and that is the remit of the last government. But my real criticism is that when we look at the awesome responsibility of the minister, we should not feel that Barbadians, we need to have an energy expert as Minister of Energy. This work is being done by the expertise that exists within the government department of the Division of Energy, and we have competent people there, competent advice there. So that perhaps we need to start working to reform the public sector to ensure that we're not talking about the minister, but we're talking about autonomous departments that can fill the breach and advise government and be responsible to Parliament to give advice when we have to come to deal with these complex pieces of legislation. Sir, again, the advisory committee advises the minister. It looks innocuous, and I understand the criticism that you might want to have a committee that the minister can rely on, and is not a rubber stamp body that just does what the minister says or presumes. Well, we understand what the government's policy is. We don't want to anger the minister who appointed us. We're grateful for the little pick that we get, and therefore there is no real independent, autonomous advice from any technical expertise coming to the minister. That has not been my experience. In fact, I think the minister will tell you some of these people who serve on these committees are overwhelming you with the level of expert knowledge that they have. But I just want to indicate their advice on the question of licenses, the issuing of licenses, the renewal of licenses, and the assignment of licenses. And in Section 8 of the Act, it states that very clearly, so that When renewal is mentioned in the act, you don't have to mention the committee. When assignment is mentioned in the act, you don't have to mention the committee every time there is a question of the issue, renewal, or assignment of licenses. I don't mean to criticize the point made by Senator Waters, but that is just cumbersome drafting of legislation. So the act should not, the bill should not be criticized because it does not refer to the committee in every other section, because the opening section of the advisory committee in clause 8 of the bill speaks to that. We have heard a lot of criticism of the bill in the short time that it was put on Parliament's website for our consideration about the whole question of the absence of interveners. Now, in clause 4, or sorry, I should say section 4 of the existing legislation, I believe is, section 5, 4B. Provision was made for an opportunity to be given to interested parties during the period in which applications for licenses are made to make representations to the minister or objections. That has been excised from the legislation. And all of a sudden, we hear the criticism that Barbadian and the public interest is now not going to be adequately represented because the government has taken this on. Now, you want to put a photovoltaic panels on your roof. What public interest element is there in giving someone the ability to go to the minister to object or make representations in relation to your license? What is the public interest there? I understand the public interest in relation if you had an electrical supplier like the public utility, which has obligations under the Fair Trading Commission Act and Utility Regulation Act in the performance of the delivery of the service. But what public interest is there at the application for a license to supply electricity? In a fair competitive market, we're not talking monopolies now, we're talking antitrust, we're talking fair competition. When an applicant applies to supply or to provide storage at the level of ordinary household or even a business, what is the interested party? What is the interested person? Could you imagine when we talk about attracting the level of investment, and not only investment in terms of dollars, but investment in terms of technology that we don't have in this country, that we want to exploit the wind, we want to exploit the sun, we want to exploit the waves and all the technology so that we can survive in this world that we are in? Can you tell me that we can plan a future for the next 20 years to depend on fossil fuels in Barbados? We understand the price of oil has gone down. We don't control the variables for oil, Brent crude on the international market. We don't even really understand why they go up and down. Because sometimes we hear that when there's a war, the price goes up. Wars all over the place now. Israel now starting war with Lebanon, but the price going down. But can you plan the 20, 25-year, 30-year future for Barbados on the basis of fossil fuel alone? Will you tell your children that as a legislator, you've participated in a debate where you have scoffed at the idea of renewable energy being part of the paradigm for how we plan out the orderly development of the country? Do we understand the ramifications of dealing with that? These are questions that have to be asked based on the questions that were asked to the government, and to show that the policy dice that you want us to roll is not as simplistic as a question of oil going down, everything in Barbados must go down at the same time. I am not a financial expert, and I can't tell you that I can delve into the futures market and these kinds of considerations. But I would certainly want to make the point that any investor who comes into Barbados, whether it bringing technology or capacity or knowledge or even financial resources into investing in our renewable energy sector, whether it's to meet goals for 2030 or whether we have to push them back, the current needs that we have as a country. What is the public interest of an interested person saying to the minister, don't come? Now, I understand if there are environmental impact considerations, because those are dealt with at the town planning stage. You still require town planning permission to erect these installations. And I will say this, we know that the Cahir project that was spoken of by the last administration, that wasn't stopped at the level of the minister issuing a license. That did not get through the environmental impact stage. So to give the impression that the removal of an intervener at the stage of the issuance of a license to operate an electrical supply system is now some great problem for the people of Barbados. This has nothing to do with rate setting or the prices determined or tariffs determined by the Fair Trading Commission. That has not been interfered with. This is a process of applying for a license to supply electricity, whether it's through generation, transmission, distribution, storage, and things of the like. Now, I am not going to say that there are no public concerns, but what is the minister required to do under the application for a license? And I can take the time to take the country through it, so the chamber through it, and hopefully the country chair, because there has been some mischief out there suggesting that the government is up to sinister motives. And the first thing is transparency. The minister makes the decision. And as I said, it's not the minister, but it's the ministry's collective work that determines how this license process will go. When the interested party says, I want to make representations, do you give them the application? Do you give them the proprietary data of the applicant? Do you give them the technology that they're planning to bring in the company so that the interested person can look at it? And at this stage, who is the interested party? The previous legislation, the existing legislation that we're attempting to repeal today, does not go into all of that. And I'm informed by lawyers who advise in the sector that several opinions have gone out since this bill was passed, this was passed into law since 2013, speaking about the problems that this section has caused. Because no investor is going to want to come and give up their proprietary data and information about their business systems just because some unknown person, an interested person, under Barbados law. It doesn't happen in Jamaica and St. Lucia where this is regulated by similar pieces of legislation. But at the license application stage, we're talking about blocking or interfering millions of dollars of investment. And it's not only foreign direct investment coming in. And I want to say to my good friend, Senator Walters, I am a full convert of the economic model of how Barbados has to operate. That was explained to me by the late Right Honorable Professor Oyenatha. Is you need to have a certain amount of foreign direct investment coming into Barbados each year, else we will not be able to balance our books or maintain the standard of quality of life. The government cannot do it by taxes or borrowing alone. And the time must come for us to stop scoffing at foreign direct investment into a small nation like Barbados. We have to accommodate it. The fulcrum of Barbados's development for 300 years has been on the basis of foreign direct investment.
Senator Walters.
Mr. President, Senator Nichols is misleading the House, suggesting that I was scoffing at foreign direct investment. The comment I made is to allow the chamber to understand that the need and request for foreign direct investment must not take over precedence over the need of consumers in this country, and that there must be a balance when moving to renewable technologies, using foreign direct investment or local investment matched squarely against the needs and the pockets of the consumers, the person that have to pay the utility bills.
Please proceed, Senator Nichols.
I thought that the good Senator rose to make the point I was making. I probably think I may have put it a little more eloquently than that. But I think he's saying the same thing that I'm saying. So I certainly don't understand why he rose to say that is a point of elucidation. I wasn't misleading. And I wasn't really speaking necessarily to the senator, a point that he made. But there is a view that foreign direct investment must be looked at with a very jaundiced eye, and that we must be very careful and very suspicious of it. And I'm saying that I'm a convert of the philosophy that if we don't have enough foreign direct investment, then the only sources of government revenue have to be taxes or borrowing. And if you want to sustain a level of quality of living in this country, given the structure of our economy and given where we have come from, we need it. So if you're going to have a busybody who, like a certain person who the court just made a person know they can't file actions in the court, but 80 actions in the court. So if you have a person who decided every time somebody applies for a license to do a renewable energy project in Barbados, and the minister has to consider, I can put in an objection. What is the public purpose of that objection? This is not an objection to how they integrate within the system and affect tariff setting, which is the domain of the FTC. This is not about the environmental impact of the development on the land in Barbados and how it affects communities. That is the domain of the town planner. This is the question. So you're going to ask the minister, or I want to see if they have the financial wherewithal to run the project. I want to see if they have the technical capacity to be able to administer this project. I want to see if their decommissioning plan 30 years from now meets the specifications 30 years from now, because I am an interested party. And if you have an interested party at the level stymieing the development, then you will frustrate the build-up of this sector. So one of the things that the government is trying to do is to play catch-up. Because when the present legislation was passed, no serious contemplation was given, as I said, to things beyond distribution. This bill that is under consideration here is so mammoth in its scope that a debate in this chamber and in the other place next week will not do justice to how it will transform. I mean, when I look at this bill, and I can go back, I had a lot more things to say, but I see the president looking at the clock. But I know I'm only 10 minutes into my presentation. System planning. That was absent from the last piece of legislation. And again, I say, I don't want my colleagues from the Democratic Labour Party, I think I can call both of them that no, sir. They're two of them here now. There was only one before, right? But the last piece of legislation, or the current legislation, did not provide for government to operate. And I think that is a symptom of the fact that there was no coherence at the ministerial level. When you have a minister of energy now, not operating within the confines of the Ministry of Finance, you can give wider scope and reflection on government policy. And that is what is happening here, because the minister now directs the planning, development, monitoring of the electricity system for the purpose of ensuring the utility, the public utility, to develop integrated resources and resilience. The minister spoke about that today. Grid modernization. Now, which legislation before required them to deal with a system, electricity system, that deals with grid modernization before? This is comprehensive, this is far-reaching. And in a country where, and I certainly have felt the impact, my colleagues on this parliamentary team know, that flooding is now going on in places in St. Thomas that never occurred before. We have now to be more resilient. And the ministry is requiring the public utility to develop systems to ensure that Barbados can meet the challenges that we have ahead. So we can talk about reducing electricity bills. I'm not saying that that is not what the government is about, but these are bigger challenges in this bill. And to ask Barbadians to dismiss the government's efforts today on the basis of whether your light bill is going to come down in October is to do an injustice to what the regime that is being ushered in by the Electrical Supply Act, its electrical supply bill purports to inaugurate in this country, Mr. President. Sir, I have no doubt that we have not gotten everything right in energy in Barbados in the last 20 or 30 years. No doubt. I have no doubt that the last administration, when they passed the Electric Light and Power Act, was making a start. This is an improvement, and I understand that there's no widespread opposition from the opposition centers, although my friend is yet to make his contribution to the debate. But I understand that there's no opposition, and we probably might get more heat than light in any event. But there is no widespread opposition to the wide impact of the bill. But I want Barbadians to start to address their minds to some of the work that government is doing outside of the filter, from my side and from the other side and any other sides. We can even listen to Senator Malloy and Senator Drakes on these matters. Keen to hear what she has to say if she's making a contribution to the debate. But sir, this bill is an important piece of legislation. When I saw it, I contacted the minister and told her in the way that I would tell her as an old schoolmate, this is a big deal. This is an important and revolutionary change in terms, not only in the liberalization of the sector, but trying to bring order to a sector that has galloped ahead of the existing legislative framework. It is also bringing a demand on the government to outfit the department, or I should say the ministry, to ensure that it can manage the requirements under this piece of legislation in a way that will redound to the benefit of Barbados long to the future. So, Mr. President, with those words, I am happy to support this bill, and I'm obliged to you for the time given to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must say that I've enjoyed this debate so far. It is an area that I'm not necessarily intimately tied to, but I do have some vested interest, particularly as it relates to how the green economy in particular in Barbados has evolved and the activities around the targets that we have for being, and I will clarify this, carbon neutral by 2030. Not 100% renewable energy. The two are distinct and different. And I think that needs to be said. But nonetheless, Mr. President, the leader of government business did a comprehensive overview of the bill. And the Honorable Member, Senator Walters, I believe, brought some good issues to the table as it relates to bringing the bill to the reality of what a lot of Barbadians feel in relation to the cost of energy in Barbados. And Mr. President, I want to go at this bill and debate it or make my contribution from the standpoint that this is a very complex issue. It is a complex sector. And its core is wrapped up in the design of the energy or the electricity sector, I would say. And I say that because the design is primarily based on 3 areas, and we've talked about them today: the cost, the type of energy, whether it's renewable or fossil fuel, and the reliability as it relates to the stability of the grid and the distribution network that you have. Those three things. And those three things, Mr. President, have trade-offs. You cannot get all three at optimum. You cannot get cheap energy that is renewable in nature right now, and it cannot be 100% reliable. That is the problem that we are facing. Because by its nature, renewable energy, as we've heard earlier, is intermittent. So it brings an element of instability to the grid, affecting the reliability. And then because of the cost of capitalizing the infrastructure, it is expensive. So, Mr. President, those are the trade-offs. So, how these things then are balanced is directly related to the design of the type of electrical system or electricity system that we have in Barbados. And if that is so, the question has to be first looked at from what do we have now, or what did we have in the past, a historical context. We had a public utility that generated, transmitted, distributed, sold electricity to all of the end users. You got your bill in the mail, you paid it, and that was how the design worked. You had a public utility that was a monopoly, that had a license, and they did everything in relation to generation, transmission, and the supply of electricity. And it was also based on fossil fuels, which relative to renewable energy was still relatively cheaper than renewables, and it was based on a reliable grid system because you had one actor managing that entire system of supply of energy. So that was the design. Because of the environmental concerns that we have globally, and Barbados, and rightly so, wanting to play its part and being a first mover and being at the forefront of best practice, we then said we wanted to move towards being 100% renewable energy supplied. And Mr. President, what that meant was a significant and disruptive transition from the old design of the electricity sector to a new design, which to my mind, Mr. President, I'm not even sure we truly understand what that design looks like. I could be wrong, but based on how the sector has moved ahead so quickly in relation to private sector interests, the technology, I'm not sure we understand what our electricity system looks like in 2035. I'm here we do. 2045, that may be an unknown because of the type of technology that we're dealing with and pace that is being developed. But what we do have is an interim period that we are in, which by nature is disruptive, and it gets messy because you're dealing with a complex system. And there are various iterations that will happen along the way. That, Mr. President, in terms of design, is where you have renewable energy being onboarded. It is intermittent, so there will be some issues with, again, reliability in terms of the stability of the grid, costly upfront, as we have heard today, and we all acknowledge that this will not be a cheap transition. And, Mr. President, we will still have to rely primarily on fossil fuel, oil, by and large, for the next 5 to 7 years. So there's still that cost element or external element of cost coming in that is being imported because we still will be importing oil from outside to sustain our energy demands. So that mix of renewable energy, fossil fuels, IPPs, independent power producers coming onto the grid, it all creates a level of disruption, Mr. President. And that is what we are experiencing at the moment. Mr. President, if then you cannot have all three things at the same time, if there are trade-offs to be made in relation to cost, reliability, and the type of energy that you have, it then has to be the question of how do you rationalize the sector in the interim until you reach the point where you want to be. And I'm happy that in this legislation that there is a dedicated section, Clause 5, we heard about it by Senator Nichols and Senator Cummings, that we are establishing a systems planning unit. It is critical that that unit is established. There was mention of a grid modeler. Mr. President, I cannot stress to you that unless that is established and functioning with all of the data requirements that it needs, we are going nowhere fast. We are going nowhere fast. Because, Mr. President, at the moment we have a number of small IPPs on the grid. We have a number of applications that are approved, but not on the grid, Mr. President. And all of those persons have an expectation of a return on investment based on the feed-in tariffs. That is the reality, Mr. President. But if those smaller producers do not make up a significant amount of the energy that is produced, you still have a responsibility through the public utility to produce electricity. So there is a balancing act that needs to be had. And I think, Mr. President, Barbadians don't have a full appreciation of that balancing act. And I'm hoping that today, based on the contributions from both the government side and the opposition side, that is the message that comes out in this debate. It will not be perfect and it will not be cheap in the short term. In the long run, that's a different story, because we all know that sometimes once investors get accustomed to a certain level of return, they find other ways to build in costs to pass on to the consumer. So instead of your usage being the bulk of your bill, it might be things like management fees, grid fees, this fees, the next thing. Mr. President, you understand where I'm going with this? So I understand the angst that a lot of Barbadians would have in relation to the cost of electricity in both the short run and the long run. Because, Mr. President, there's a saying here in Barbados that once it goes up in Barbados, it don't come back down. Once it goes up, it does not come back down. But, sir, in saying that, I want to also highlight that there's another element of the system that also is not being taken into consideration in terms of the cost to the end consumer, and that is those who would then onboard storage. That discussion in the full public domain has not been had, Mr. President. So there are a number of elements that still need to be integrated from an engineering standpoint, but from the economic standpoint, have not been fully fleshed out, discussed, and understood by the country. Mr. President, as I said, this balancing act between cost, reliability, and the type of energy is also reflected in what the Barbados Light and Power at the moment, based on at December 2023, the information coming from the Barbados Light and Power is that of every dollar of revenue, and this is where it gets very crystal clear, pun intended, yes, pun intended, every dollar of revenue that Barbados Light and Power receives in revenues, 51 cents goes to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. 51%. So half of the revenues that the Barbados Light and Power collects goes to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. And if, again, we're saying we want to place more producers onto the grid, that means what? Greater level of feed-in tariffs. But again, if we increase the amount of producers, but we're still being reliant to a substantive degree on fossil fuel, the fuel costs will also remain. So there is an element, Mr. President, of what the consumer will pay in the short run that I genuinely, and I asked this question, I think it was in the last bill that we spoke about. I think there was an amendment to this bill, to the previous bill, the act. And I said, there needs to be a clear, frank conversation to Barbadians about their electricity costs in the next 3 to 5 years. Because the economic argument around moving towards renewable energy was that we were going to save foreign exchange because we are no longer going to import the level of fossil fuels that we had in the past, and we were going to save that foreign exchange, and therefore there was an economic argument. But if in the interim, fuel cost still remains in the system and being produced on the grid, feeding electricity, we have the IPPs moving into the sector, and 51% of the revenues collected by the Barbados Light and Power in 2023, of every dollar, is going to fuel costs and feed-in tariffs. We are stuck somewhere at square one as it relates to cost, Mr. President. And I want to highlight here, Mr. President, based on global petrol prices data, 2023, the average global cost of residential electricity based on 150 countries was 15 cents per kilowatt hour. For commercial, 15 cents per kilowatt hour.
Sorry, Senator Drake, just to be clear, in what currency?
US.
US dollars.
US dollars,
Thank you.
Mr. President, so that there's a parity across when I speak to different countries. The global average in US dollars is 15 cents per kilowatt, or you can round that off to 16 cents for residential rates per kilowatt hour, and 15 cents for commercial. In Barbados, Mr. President, it is US 31 cents per kilowatt for residential rates, and 37 cents per kilowatt for commercial. And that is based on a number of things. The small size of the market, the tax regime, the cost of energy from Barbados from anywhere in the world in terms of shipping costs, Mr. President. Other Caribbean countries, Mr. President, Jamaica, their residential average costs, US 27 cents per kilowatt for residential rates. Trinidad, of course, oil and gas country, as we know here. I will ignore the asides, Mr. President. 5 cents, just next door to us. Sounds nice, it does. But again, the trade-off, it would be considered dirty fuel based on the discussion around renewable energy, but it is cheap. That's why I'm trying to get people to understand this trade-off is real, Mr. President, and it must be managed. The only other countries in the region that have a higher rate than Barbados in terms of the residential cost, Bahamas at US 42 cents per kilowatt, and Bermuda 52 cents per kilowatt. So, Mr. President, the question overall then has to be, what energy system design gives us the most affordable energy given the renewable energy targets that we have that is reliable? That is the question. That is the question. What is the energy design that allows us to at least optimize our ability to move towards renewable, get the price down, and still maintain a reliable grid that allows for the smooth day-to-day running of Barbados? Because from the time you have an unstable grid, everything goes haywire. Ask the people in places like South Africa that have to do load sharing, where you have to shut down one place so that you can bring online another place. Load shedding, sorry, right? You cannot manage an economy, you cannot manage a society, Mr. President, with that type, especially in Barbados where we're so small. We cannot manage our electricity system in that way, so there needs to be reliability. But, Mr. President, that question around cost, around reliability, and around renewable energy is impacted by some other things. We know that we have a quarterly report by the central bank governor, and the sole mission from both sides of the aisle, I think they would agree, is that Barbados must grow. But in order to grow, you need energy. In order to grow, you need energy, Mr. President. And then what type of energy mix is appropriate, given the new technologies that are coming on stream? In addition to that, I think a conversation around the number of players in the industry and the size also needs, and the technology needs to be considered. The producers, the storage providers, all of those things need to be taken into consideration as it relates to design. And then, on top of that, the geopolitical conditions. Senator Malu raised the issue this morning, earlier, about China. We have the US gun-ho ready if drill, baby drill. So if we have a situation where the price of energy, or a barrel of oil, the price of a barrel of oil dropped to $50 US, you know how many countries, Mr. President, can put renewable energy targets on hold? Just that one factor. So we have to decide what we are going to commit to. I believe that there have been iterations of the Barbados National Energy Policy that has charted a way forward. Clearly, there is a lot happening in this space, and we may possibly now have to reconsider timelines and targets. There's no bigger proponent for the green economy and utilizing things like wave energy than Senator Drake, Mr. President. However, there's a sobriety that needs to be had as well, and practicality. Because if we are moving in a direction where Barbadians cannot afford the transition, then we have to relook. How are we going to balance the type of energy that we're bringing on board for Barbadians to consume and the cost of that electricity? The cost of that energy, and then by and large, the cost of electricity, Mr. President. Sir, if we are saying that these things are not mutually inclusive, we cannot have it all. And we are living in a time where the cost of living across the globe, not just Barbados, across the globe. You talk to anybody in the United States, United Kingdom, they will tell you, or if you just travel outside of Barbados, you will realize that this is a global problem. Granted, Barbados has the ability through its tax regimes to impact and affect the cost at things like pump. That is something the government can do in terms of policy and relief. But however, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic policies that were instituted then, Mr. President, we are actually now seeing the effects of it from an economic standpoint in terms of the cost of goods and services globally. And Mr. President, I will wrap up by saying that I am hoping, and based on this bill, there seems to be a lot of work that is happening in the renewable energy space and the electricity sector. One of the glaring omissions, however, and this was raised earlier, is the license to the public utility. That is a major factor in what that energy system looks like and the electrical system looks like in the future, or in very near future at that, Mr. President. And I think that it is the government's responsibility to be frank and open about what are the plans as it relates to the public utility, and how that then will affect consumers at the end of the day. Because as I've noted, if we are billing in costs that both includes fossil fuels and the feed-in tariffs, then do we have to then look at things like subsidized rates for lower income housings? For instance, households that have greater than 7 persons below a certain income bracket. Those are the types of policies that we would have to start to look at, so that the people at the bottom, the people who simply cannot afford, not the ones running ACs all day long, but the people who have a certain level of standard of living, Mr. President, that they are kept above something that is dignified in Barbados. Because, Mr. President, if that is the case, and there is a substantial increase in electricity rates without a review of the characteristics and the types of households and their usage, we're going to find ourselves in an even worse situation as it relates to poverty. Poverty, Mr. President. But I assume that the government, because it usually says it has all bases covered, they are thinking about these things. And I'm sure that the substantive minister, who is the leader of government business, has been in consultation about these forward potential scenarios as it relates to the cost and the cost of energy and the price the consumer pays if we continue to have these built-in costs that make up, as I said earlier, at the moment, 51 cents out of every dollar of revenue that the Barbados Light and Power collects. So, Mr. President, this issue of renewable energy, it is an issue of energy security, it is an issue of national security, but it is also directly and intimately related to our ability to transact and produce, supply goods and services here in Barbados. Once you increase electricity rates, everything, Mr. President, increases. Every single thing increases. Something as simple as refrigeration for cold storage goods is affected. So I, Mr. President, will continue to monitor from the outside what is happening in this space. There are a lot of things I like in the bill, I would say that, but there are also some things that concern me. But Mr. President, my aim this afternoon was to highlight that it is an issue of design. Design affects the economics, design affects the type of energy system or the types of energy systems that we have on board. And Mr. President, it affects basically our way of life and how we as a people use, produce, and interact with energy and electricity, Mr. President. And as my voice is going, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Driggs. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to make my contribution to this debate on the electric supply bill. And to me, it is, well, it can almost say a bittersweet, well, bitter moment, because I had the privilege of actually speaking on the Electric Light and Power Act 2013 when that act was, this bill was introduced. I spoke on this bill in the Senate, and the renewable energy sector is an area for which I have some interest and have followed for a long while. And I can tell you as been said before, in terms of the intention behind this, the 2013 legislation, because at that time, renewable energy supplying to the grid was not something that was widely done. In terms of utilizing solar panels, that was the extent to which we went at that time. But in 2019, we would have done an assessment of the possibility for integrating renewable energy into our power generation. And we found that there was tremendous scope for it, and also scope as well too for switching out some of the utilities that, that we utilize, like the lighting and all of those things were put in place. So hence this act came into being in 2013, which started a new sector within Barbados, the renewable energy sector, which many persons had benefited from in terms of being able to place solar panels at that time on the roofs of homes or businesses and receive payment from the Light and Power for supplying them with energy to the grid. So there was a basis for it, and it was more or less taking us from a period of time where we focused mostly on fossil fuel to offering other alternatives to power generation within this country. And at that time, we must recognize that this is an industry which continues to change, as Senator Cummins would have mentioned. The technologies would continue to change, and you had to do feasibility studies at that time to determine what was the best course of action for a small island developing state such as Barbados to take, recognizing that we are not a state in the US where we have the capacity that any excess power we can possibly wheel to another state. We are not a state in Europe where any excess power we can possibly wheel to another country. And even though we are close geographically in the Caribbean, it's still not necessarily practical at this time, even though it is done, where in Europe, because it is a significant investment cost. So you have to determine how you are going to invest in the industry and what challenges you're going to take on. And for that matter, the point made by Senator Nichols for the absence of a note on storage in the legislation at that time, I'm certain that persons who are investors in the renewable energy sector will tell you that that was possibly not a feasible alternative at that time because of the costs of implementing the storage at that time. But now, over the years, especially since there is a trust to integrate more renewable energy, we've seen a reduction in the cost of the solar panels and all of the inputs required for that. And we've also begun to see a reduction in the costs for the implementation of this battery storage. Quite frankly, we have quite a bit of battery storage driving around the country on a daily basis. So you have the cars and you have the buses, you have a sanitation truck, you have other things I understand that could be possibly used for storage. So now the idea of storage is now a reality that a small island developing state such as Barbados can tackle. And for that reason, I can understand why there is legislation to speak to storage now in this bill, because legislation has to be implemented. Legislation has to be implemented. So it doesn't make sense in speaking about legislation that you cannot feasibly implement, or the cost of implementation of that legislation will become a prohibitive burden on the people of the country. All of these are things that you have to take into consideration when you are putting together or drafting a piece of legislation. How will it be implemented? How will it work? And the impact that it would have on the citizens. And it's for that reason that I listened very carefully this morning to Senator Cummings in her introduction of the bill. And yes, she did spend a lot of time in terms of going through the actual drafting of the legislation, even though there's not much new to the legislation compared to the 2013 legislation. And even from the time I read it, I wondered, why didn't we just simply amend the 2013 legislation to include the one or two new pieces pieces which are now within this legislation. Because when I read this legislation on the Wednesday night, I was preparing for the meeting on Thursday, it was almost like a bit of deja vu. I said, I do prepare, and Mr. President, I do prepare, and I do read, even if in some instances it would just be to gloss over some things. But I did read through the legislation. It was a bit of deja vu, because I said, well, a lot of this looks very similar to the 2013 legislation. And I wondered why the government, even, I know that most people boast that this is probably, this government boasts of being very highly academic and skilled and everything, but I mean, but sometimes you may overestimate your, ability in trying to actually reinvent the wheel. Because you had a piece of legislation which is there. And I've noticed this oftentimes with legislation brought to this chamber, that it is almost to try to rewrite history by giving the legislation a different title, because that's all that you have done, which I don't know, Senator Nichols, as a legal person in here in terms of drafting and the impact that this may have on the court system, and in terms of person researching the legislation in the future, because you could have been a little bit tidier in maintaining the name of the legislation so that anyone who is interested in the sector will be able to easily find the changes and the amendment to the legislation. Because you know what? When you are looking at investing, you have to be able to find the legislation to make sure that the project that you are looking to bring to the country falls in line with the legislation. So you have this whole name change, but I guess that Minister Cummings wanted to make sure that she can stamp her approval on something, and here she has done it today with the Electricity Supply Act bill, and that is what she has brought to the legislative process in Barbados. So I think that all of you should tap the tables for her. But I also want to say that we cannot give people the false hope that changing legislation changes the reality within the sector. And that is what I would want to speak about. Changing legislation does not change the reality within the sector if the policymakers do not understand how the sector works and how the sector operates and what is needed in order to bring to life and make reality the legislation which you have just created. Now, many of the things in this legislation I said existed in the previous legislation. Even the one which Senator Nichols made heavy weather about in terms of the systems planning. But good. I can credit you with expanding on it in a little bit more detail because that is important for the renewable energy sector to work. Because you have to recognize that in Barbados, we have a finite resource in terms of the amount of electricity we can supply. Even though you may be able to produce 300 megawatts, our system only utilizes 175 megawatts as the information is, right? So even if so therefore, within this legislation that we had before, and before the government came to office and basically put renewable energy on steroids, as Senator Waters would have mentioned in his presentation, I must commend him for his presentation this morning in terms of bringing this piece of legislation to the actual people of Barbados to let us know how it will impact on us. And I would want to make a quote from a BREA conference in 2016. The whole idea of why we moved to this trust of renewable energy. And that quote says, we can no longer afford to have some of the highest electricity rates in the world, which in some cases are 5 times higher than what exists in industrialized countries. And the whole idea was that we gone into this project to make Barbados more competitive in terms of electricity. When you look at every single sector in Barbados, electricity is more or less the cost leader in the majority of all of our sectors. In the manufacturing sector, it is electricity. That is why our manufacturing sector is not as competitive as Trinidad. In the tourism sector, electricity also plays a role as well. So it will have an impact on the room rates that we charge, or the fact that some hotels are actually now charging the occupants to utilize AC and things like that. So it has an impact on our competitiveness. And these are things that we must pay attention to not only when we are legislating, but when we are also implementing policy as well. So what we're doing here today is just a cosmetic change of name, but I have not heard the minister speak about the actual issues that will change the gridlock that we currently face within the renewable energy sector. And when I say gridlock, Senator Walters mentioned it. He mentioned that there were, how many? There were probably over 105 megawatts of renewable energy still waiting to get onto the system. That shows that we have a system that is not working. Now, when this administration came to office in 2018, you had a renewable energy sector which was more or less regulated. We knew that we could only take X amount of renewable energy onto the system. Therefore, Barbados Light and Power licenses were offered to take up that. But then there was a change in policy which opened up the floodgates for larger solar fields in Barbados, which more or less knocked out the average householder who wanted to get a 3 kilowatt system on their roof or even a 5 kilowatt system, because now you have a solar field with 100 megawatts taking out that capacity from individuals. So that is why what Senator Walters was saying made absolute sense, because you are now having a renewable energy sector where the average Barbadian, they do not see the benefit of it, but to them, it comes at a cost. Because you are hearing the Fair Trading Commission recently speak to putting battery storage, allowing battery storage onto the grid, and that would come at a significant cost, which could result in electricity bills being increased by as much as $40 to allow for that battery storage to come onto the grid. Now that is going to be a significant pain and a burn for the average householder who already cannot afford the electricity bill. But now you are having it done in that way because we want to quickly accommodate all of those investors who are out there waiting and suffering and burning, because we knew for 6 years that there was not adequate battery storage on island. Can't say this minister because this minister was not there for the entire 6 years, but what did the government do to facilitate getting that battery storage in place so that you can have a smooth transition and roll out within the renewable energy sector so that it would not right now be in gridlock, but it would be operating efficiently. So that's the point that I want to make. Changing legislation does not mean that the sector will operate efficiently. The administrators, the policymakers, the government of the day must understand how the sector works, as Senator Drakes pointed out in her presentation not too long ago. And I completely agree with you and see where you're going. You must understand, and I did not hear much of that. I did not hear the minister speak anything about baseload projects, which would have been good, even though there may be some in the pipeline. It would have been good to give Barbadians the reassurance that those projects are there, because it is having baseload projects that would allow the Barbados Light and Power to basically take more renewable energy sources which are variable onto the grid. Because the baseload projects are consistent and they do, you can ramp them up or turn them down based on the need. But majority of the renewable energy projects that we use now are variable. You have to depend on, as Senator Cummings would have mentioned, the amount of wind in the area and also the cloud cover as well. So these are things that I was hoping to hear more of from Senator Cummings in her introduction, but she'll probably get to it in her wrap-up and give us some reassurance. But this is a comprehensive piece of legislation, and it is a set to, I cannot put down the legislation because it's basically the same legislation. It is basically the same legislation as 2013. So it is basically the same legislation as 2013. It's just that it has the stamp of approval of Senator Cummings now. Basically the same legislation as 2013. So you can't go against it. You can't go against it. All I'm saying is the point, cosmetic changes do not bring any efficiency into the sector, and that is what Barbadians want. Barbadians want to know that we have a renewable energy sector which they can benefit from. A renewable energy sector which not only reduces the dependence on fossil fuel, but they should also be able to feel it, because energy drives the economy. So you should be able to feel it in the cost of living in this country. And just as Senator Walters mentioned, the cost of living, including the price of energy at the pump, the cost of living, including what we pay for electricity on our monthly bills, and all of those things, because it impacts in transportation, it impacts how much the producers here in Barbados, what it costs for them to produce, not only manufacturers, but we offer the service sectors as well in terms of the hotel industry. So energy is not something that we should scoff about and get into this notion that if to bring on renewable energy, we must expect an increase in costs. I think that we need to ask the question, do we need to bring on every single bit of renewable energy, or do we need to bring it on all now, or should we phase out, give ourselves a little bit more time so that Barbadians can actually feel the benefit in their pocket just like everyone else. So we need to hear these things from the minister as she articulates the bill, so that we would know that communities that want to have households that want to get a 3 kilowatt system or even a 1 kilowatt system, but still that there's room on the grid for them. That is not there now. So how does the minister plan to address that? That you don't have to wait 6 months, a year, 2 years, or 3 years to get approval for your system, for the person that may just want a little 1 kilowatt system. We can't even depend on the Hope houses, which were supposed to be offering some sort of component with regard to renewable energy. Is that not the case, Senator Nichols? Through you, Mr. President? So we can't depend on that either. So these are questions that we really need to answer in here, because what we have seen is a renewable energy policy which has bypassed the average Barbadian and has gone more to the larger businesses and the deep pocket investors. That is not the equitable distribution of this industry. And even though you speak to it in this legislation in terms of including local investment, it needs to be more operational. It needs to be something tangible that you can see in terms of making sure that every single Barbadian can benefit from this investment in renewable energy. I applaud the fund, because and there's nothing novel about it in terms of the System Benefit Fund. And there's really nothing novel about it, because I think we had a similar fund here where we would have allowed companies to do energy audits. And also we had a complete program throughout Barbados where Energy Smart Fund, correct, thank you, where households were able to change out their lighting to LED lighting to see a reduction in cost. So anything that can help householders recognize a reduction in cost, I would applaud, and I'm hoping that this fund would do just that. There are some issues, though, with regard to, now, Senator Nichols also made the comment with regard to the interveners. And I think that there is a place for interveners as well. And I think that many Barbadians would be happy to hear if the minister would say that there will still be some scope and avenue for interveners to make contributions, especially to the Fair Trading Commission, on their behalf with regard to when this new bill is implemented. Now, I would want to go back because I remember it was mentioned when we piloted the 2013 bill, there was a comment by the other side that the powers offered to the minister were too wide. But we have here a situation that the powers offered to the ministers were too wide by the other side. Now, we have a bit of legislation here where it seems as though the powers offered to the minister are limitless and they go without bounds. And that is something that we need to look into. The 2013 legislation was better worded in terms of, no, but y'all, it was better worded in terms of application for issues of a license, which would be section 5.3, where the applicant.
So just for clarity's sake, you're referring to the
2013 legislation.
Yeah. Electric Light and Power Act of 2013. Thank you.
The Electric Light and Power Act of 2013. But there was a requirement in here for an applicant coming as a utility to actually be published in the paper for 3 months so that the public would know what is going on and who has interest, because operating a public utility is not the same thing as operating a mom and pop shop. This is something that impacts on everybody in Barbados. And it is necessary not only because the legislation speaks about transparency, but it stops at transparency at the point where it speaks about transparency in terms of the revenue, which is Clause 3D, promote transparency in the identification and allocation of costs and revenues within the electricity sector. But why didn't we just go a step further and also the issue, who are the players who will be operating within the sector as well? We all know today that the player is Barbados Light and Power, who controls the grid, but I think that the public should be comfortable to know who are these new players with intention to come on board, who will be operating in the same space as Barbados Light and Power. So why not take the transparency to that extent, where you also publish in the papers your intention, as was the case in the 2013 Act, and allow persons time to have the opportunity to review it and also to offer any comment on it as well. So why not consider taking transparency down to that level? There's so much uncertainty in this legislation, and the way how it is currently written, the way how it is currently written, the minister can hold that information close to well, I wouldn't say her because the minister may not always be this Senator Cummings, but hold that information close to their chest for a very long time, and then the country only knows about it at the last minute when you cannot have an objection to it, or it may be too late to make a change. So the public have a right to know. And we understand this is an industry where you expect stability, and you expect that the persons coming in to operate will have the technical ability to do the job so that we can maintain a stable grid. So these are things that we need to look into. There's also the competitive bidding being spoke about, and also the committee which is formed by the cabinet to review these competitive bids. Now, the question is, why do we need to go that route when there's already legislation which speaks to procurement in this country? Legislation which was recently updated where a PS is allowed to do procurement up, it was shifted from up to 100,000 to 200,000, and then there's a procurement committee put in place. Why do we need to put into this legislation a separate method of procurement, and we have not identified the individuals who would constitute the committee? It seems as though the individuals who can constitute the committee can be changed at the whim and the fancies of the cabinet. What is really going to go on in that procurement process? And I think that the minister should do everything possible to make sure that there's transparency, and at every point in time that, no one can say that your hands have been in the cookie jar or seem close to going into the cookie jar, anything of that nature. So when you put legislation like this, it opens up the back door for it to be misused and manipulated. So that is something that I would want for the minister to pay attention to as she goes through the legislation. There's also the obligations which Senator Walters would have mentioned before in clause 12(2)(b). The obligations, which seems a bit strange, include in a license a condition requiring a licensee to comply with such other obligations. What are these such other obligations? Whether or not relating to the activities authorized by the license, as appears to the minister to be necessary or expedient for the purposes of this act. That gives the minister too much leverage in the process, especially in a process where you are bidding for a license and you are at the disposal, more or less, of the minister in order to obtain this license. These are things that should be regulated by the committee. And there's also the may within the legislation, because in some instances it does not say that the minister has to take the advice of the committee. It says may, when in the other legislation it said shall, which means that it has to go through the committee. Extensive committee was already in place to do these things. Why not utilize these functions and not put too much at the discretion of the minister?
Your time is up. Please wind up.
All right, thank you, Mr. President. And with that, I would want to say, cosmetic changes do not bring about efficiency. And I'll say it again because it is important, and we need to hear from the government how do they intend to deal with the gridlock in the renewable energy sector so that it can continue to bring in the much needed foreign direct investment which Senator Nichols spoke to. So just changing the name does not mean that you have fixed the problem. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Worrell. Thank you. Senator Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise at the late hour in the debate, but I felt it necessary so as to put on record a few things. But I want to, first of all, use this occasion to welcome Senator Worrell back to the chamber. Of course, he was here in a different era. But it's interesting, Mr. President, that in his first presentation in this dual dispensation, that he chose to, in my view, try to sanitize what we now know as the lost decade, in trying to suggest that the legislation today is really a carbon copy of what was there before. Nothing could be further from the truth. But equally, one of the things that I note is that his senatorial leader sat and looked at him almost as my man we were talking about. So therefore, I believe that we're in for some very interesting times. But that notwithstanding, I want to preface this debate this afternoon in terms of my contribution in the context of the future of Barbados. And why so? There can be no future of our country, or any country for that matter, without certainty of a number of things. food security, citizen security in the context of national security and peace, and equally, energy security and energy independence. And this debate and this bill today, therefore, finds itself within that third limb of energy security and energy independence for Barbados. So why is that important? We would have heard the question being asked by the leader of opposition business. Why is it that we're looking to have a thrust towards renewable energy? And I touched on a few, but I want to repeat them and add a bit more. One, as we all know, and as we've heard extensively today, the aspect with respect to the importance of the environment. There's no secret, we live it, we feel it, that Barbados and countries in the Caribbean continue to be on the front line of the climate crisis. But equally, with respect to fossil fuels and its negative impact on the world, one of the things that I remember in my tenure abroad is that one of the things that has to happen when you're a country that advocates for a particular course of action is that you use your moral leadership, which Barbados has around the world on the issue of sustainability and energy and the climate. But what you invariably ask other countries to do, you must do domestically. And it must be a part of your example and say, hey, I'm saying to you in the world, this is what you should do relative to the issue of the climate crisis and ensuring that we change our behavior. And Barbados, led by Prime Minister Motley and this administration, continues to put its mouth where its money is with respect to this issue of energy. So today's debate isn't just only about electricity, as the name would suggest in the bill. This really is about part and parcel of a broader strategy of the government with respect to energy security and energy independence as a nation going forward. And secondly, of course, the importance of why the move towards renewable energy is, of course, the savings of foreign exchange. I remember as a young person coming up, you would turn on your TV, whether it be CNN or BBC, Al Jazeera, you name it, and you would see all of the different discussions and angst in the international market with respect to the cost of energy, the rise in the price of oil. And as a country which does not produce, well, certainly in any large measure, we're takers of the price, we import oil, and therefore our country's economy, and it seems, Mr. Speaker, in some quarters of this country, and perhaps on the other side, that economic success and economic development and economic prowess is a bad word. And let me state for the record that no society, no country can thrive and provide for its people, can attract foreign investment, which is not a bad word, cannot ensure sustainability, cannot pay for roads and schools and hospitals, and pay for those amongst us who are vulnerable without an economy that can provide for those areas. It does not take talk and pretty talk and well wishes. It needs sound economic prudence. And therefore the idea that economic success and economic development and economic growth is not necessarily a thing that we need to have as a strong society should be put to bed as the wrong thing. But equally and importantly, notwithstanding the importance of ensuring that we have a safe physical environment and a clean environment, notwithstanding the importance of ensuring that we have significant foreign exchange earnings as a nation, but thirdly and importantly is really the competitiveness of our jurisdiction. That is important for many reasons. Why? And it was referred to by many of the speakers today. When you look at different jurisdictions around the world, particularly as you want to create a manufacturing sector that can not only supply your domestic needs, but can be a major exporter of goods, particularly goods, but of course services, but particularly goods. That competitiveness needs to be underscored by an energy framework and system that allows for you to produce the goods in a very competitive way, a robust way, in an efficient way, based on a low cost of energy. And when you look around the world, the countries that continue to be on the forefront of significant smart manufacturing, and 2, manufacturing that leads to high levels of export, and 3, those high exports leading to significant levels of foreign exchange and large GDPs, they're all underscored by energy frameworks and sectors that are of low cost. Whether we talk about China, Singapore, South Korea, Trinidad right next door. All of them, bar none, have significant sectors of energy that have low cost. And therefore, as we talk about the future of Barbados, there's a temptation by many people who come to public life to drive forward looking into the rearview mirror. And that, in my view, leads to what can only be described as reckless driving. And when you talk about the future of Barbados, it requires all of us who come to public life to ensure that as we look to what the future must be, we mustn't only contemplate the now, today's reality. We have to look and ask ourselves, what do we want our jurisdiction to look like? Not just for foreign investors, no. For our domestic citizens and residents, for those born and unborn. And therefore now is the time that as you look towards not just 2030, but 2035, of course, the 5-year change had to come as a result of COVID. But as you look to 2035 and beyond, ask yourself, what does Barbados need to become a competitive jurisdiction that can produce goods and services for domestic consumption at a reasonable cost, can produce goods and services that can be exported, not just across CARICOM, but around the world at a competitive cost, particularly given that we have a strong currency, which therefore makes naturally our exports a lot more expensive. So we have to find ways with a mix of technology and energy and innovation to ensure that the baseline has a mix that allows for competitiveness. But beyond the competitive measure, ensuring that our people can have a quality of life that we've hitherto enjoyed since 1966, post-independence, and moving on. Because why? The world continues to change. The world owes Barbados nothing, Mr. President. And as legislators, we have to ensure that we look ahead to prepare our people for that competitive reality. And therefore, with respect to the 4th limb, resilience. You see constantly external shocks coming to our country, coming to our region. When you think that you've turned the corner, finally, and you're walking down the road we go, an external shock comes. We came to office in 2018 when we had to stabilize the country after 23 downgrades under the last administration. And we've been able to save the dollar, we've been able to stabilize the economy, and we've been able to grow. But you remember, Mr. President, in 2020, we were confronted, and then the world was confronted, with not the 2008 financial crisis, which of course was significant, but nowhere near as negatively impactful as the COVID-19 pandemic. And we had to confront that as a nation. But out of that, as they say, you should never waste a good crisis. And out of the 2020-21 experience of COVID, the government of Barbados took a bold decision that we will use the crisis to further reposition. I note the word further, because of course after 2018, the country was in that mode of resilience building. But it took a further decision of further repositioning ourselves as a resilient jurisdiction. And we did all that once under an IMF program. And when we talk about energy, in the bounds of COVID and recovery of COVID, we're still able to have electric buses on our road. After not having buses being purchased for 10 years. And I hope, Mr. President, that my new senatorial colleague is listening and can be reminded of that fact, that when there was that lost decade, no buses were bought. None. And that's unfortunate, but notwithstanding the difficulties that we had to confront, the government took a bold decision that as Barbados is saying, here we are, looking down the road as to where we have to go in 2035 and beyond, we are still going to put our mouth where our money is. And this is not to appease any international anybody. We as a country, a new republic, have determined for ourselves that for us to go forward as a powerful nation state, that we have to determine what our interests are. And energy efficiency and energy independence must be part and parcel of that new republic, not just today, not just in 10 years' time, but going forward. So as you move to that mode of 100% renewable energy, as it were, the magic line, as it were, whether oil goes up or down, broadly, we must be in a place where we can be competitive to export our goods and services, provide quality and cost-efficient energy to our people, and to ensure that the country has the ability to weather any storm, irrespective of any external shock going forward. And that has to be part and parcel of the legislators' remit, as it were, of Barbados. Now, I want to very briefly look and place this debate a bit further within the context of the Barbados Investment Plan, which, of course, in terms of its title, and I'm prepared to make this a document of the House, Mr. President, Barbados 2035, a plan for investment in prosperity, and the operative word here that I love so much, and resilience. And I want to focus very briefly on the investment priority number 8, which focuses on a fully renewable and energy independent island. And in this context, of course, we're talking about Barbados. And it speaks to, Mr. President, the first limb, power, focusing on a mix of solar and wind and hydrogen and gas and storage so as to meet domestic power needs. That's the first aspect. The second one, industry, which I've touched on, manufacturing, competitiveness, the business sector, as it were, electrify industrial processes for decarbonization. Now, why is that decarbonization important? Because even when you look at the shipping sector, shipping, of course, is a major plank of international trade. Domestically, of course, manufacturing, as I said, is needed to help to produce the goods that we need for domestic consumption and exporting. But as you grow, part of the problem that we've had over the years, and this was a major issue in the World Trade Organization, is that the world was confronted with the problem of, as you grew economies, as you grew your production, you were using those fossil fuels that caused the problem that we're now facing in terms of the environment. So therefore, how do you decarbonize your processes that you grow, but you grow in a way that doesn't harm your environment? So it causes, therefore, for us now to relook. And it takes investment, because it just can't take political will. You need financing to do so. So while some people may scoff at the idea of financing and foreign direct investment, small states have limited options. And whilst Barbados is en route and pursuit to become a powerful, wealthy nation in the future, that transition requires for us to do a number of things in the interest of the long term. Mr. President, Singapore, as we know today, did not reach where they are today by talk. They reached it by a vision underscored by Lee Kuan Yew. He made sure that his domestic policies were in line with the international realities, but notwithstanding the rough seas that he had to go through and the country, he made sure that the country went through with temerity and focus. Same thing with Germany, the largest economy in the European Union. Same thing with Norway. The point I'm making is that it requires for us to dig deep. And we have to, and I think this was mentioned by a number of speakers today, the energy transition that we are undertaking in this country will require of us to continually have a level of public engagement with our people. Because why? When societies transition, you're not talking about transition from a course of behavior that happened 2 years ago to now. We're talking about over the last 300 years, particularly in the post-industrial revolution world, of changing your processes completely. You know it's 200 to 300 years of a behavior or pattern or systems. So you're now saying in a short time, because the truth is 5, 10, 15 years, in that spate of time is not a long time. And therefore, it causes us to have to become nimble and creative and determinate as a nation. But one of the things that I'm happy about is that Barbadians and Barbados has in its DNA the ability to pivot. That is what makes us Barbadians. Being Barbadian isn't only being born here at the QEH. Being Barbadian in our DNA is about being resilient. You can throw anything at a Bajan, but he's going to stand tall and rise to the occasion. Because why? History has shown us that notwithstanding the difficulties we've had to endure, that we have the ability to not only come out on top, but to lead others in our pursuit of greatness and destiny. And this debate today, and whilst others may scoff at it, as I said, try to sanitize a lost decade that brought hardship, brought a situation where people could not pay their education at University of the West Indies, financial impropriety, a whole host of things. This debate today, and Senator Cummings, I want to publicly, and let me make sure the microphone is clear in my mouth, use this opportunity to forever praise you, not just for laying the debate you built today, but for the work that you've been doing. Even when I was in Geneva, Mr. President, I used to sit from thousands of miles away and admire the temerity and work, not only within her ministry, but how she brought all these stakeholders together from across the country. The international meetings that she engaged, putting Barbados's advanced interests and offensive interests on the table. And people talk, you cannot, if you're not at the global table, you don't have a space to influence nothing. Nothing, sir. But you get my point. And Senator Cummings, we in this generation and the future owe a debt to you. And I want to make it clear that there has to be a situation where we're looking at, of course, we're coming to the chamber week after week, but there's certain pieces of bills and legislation that must be so about the developmental prospects and opportunities of future Barbados, but of course underscored by today, that we have to rise to the occasion in ensuring that what we say and what we do is in that interest of broad perspective, and this is one of them. But I just want to go on very briefly. In that same investment plan, it talks about transport, low-carbon vehicle expansion, passenger cars, buses, trucks, and motorcycles. I was in China about 2 weeks ago at the 4th China-Caribbean Economic Forum and Trading Forum, Mr. President. And one of the things that stood to my mind, first of all, is the advancement of the transportation sector to when I last was in China 3 years prior. And everywhere you look, the transportation system, whether it be public or private, and in particular private vehicles, mainly electric vehicles, or hybrid. Because why? They understand that as part of the new era of development for their people and the world, this is the direction that we have to move in. And Barbados' energy efficiency is not about following anybody. It is about saying, first of all, as I said, this is an imperative for our national good and development. And this is where we have to go. And I also therefore want to use this occasion to call on our young people, our persons at Polytechnic, our persons at UWI, our persons in secondary school, equally our persons who are not in any informal education or may have benefited from any informal education, and here's why there has to be that buttressing of support for them. But our people must now be able to conceive ideas that can treat to creation of goods and services that are energy efficient for domestic consumption and for export around the world. And I believe strongly, and it is something that I think that we really must pursue, that in order for Barbados to be competitive even further in this area, that we must not only rely on the technology transfer and knowledge transfer in other areas from around the world, but that there must be a significant component of research and development domestically here, government, private sector, academia, which allows for ideas to contend, and then you have those ideas being able to be exported around the world. Those countries who have done it have continued to not only advance, but to be at the head of the curve. As I said at the onset, Mr. President, sir, I'm here placing this debate in the context of the future of Barbados. And I see this debate almost as a Lee Kuan Yew moment, if I should use that term. Truly. And that's why I heap such praise on Senator Cummings. Because Barbados has within its DNA the ability to turn the intellectual rigor and muscle coming out of KFIL, or our students who go to St. Augustine, or Mona, or SJPI here domestically, BCC, but equally our sixth formers. We must not believe that education and certification is only about getting a good job. I want to see the engineers coming out of school conceiving ideas that can compete and even beat their Chinese and Singaporean and Japanese counterparts on these critical issues. Who says that a Barbadian cannot conceive and produce the energy efficiency models or the technology in energy transport that comes out of South Korea? There's nothing stopping us, Mr. President. But we have to order it in a way that allows for that to happen. And today, what Senator Cummings is doing, in my view, is laying part of the big foundation, coupled with the education reform that the Ministry of Education is taking place, coupled with the knowledge creation economy that the Ministry of Economic Affairs is taking place, and missed in creating a Barbados that is globally competitive, but equally allowing for us domestically to meet our quality of life aspirations and provisions. And just to bring it home, Mr. President, I would have mentioned the countries who have advanced in this area. And you can see where they have come from within the last 20 years, 15 years. And they too went through transition. I remember stepping outside of energy, but more into the realm of water. And of course, to my immediate left is the minister with responsibility for water. But Singapore had an issue with water. And they were relying on Malaysia for their water, particularly given that it was Malaysia and Singapore, then Singapore became independent. But there was an issue that Singapore had with Malaysia. And they realized that Singapore, notwithstanding its competitiveness and GDP, they were still dependent. And it took them a bold decision. I am not even sure if this part of the world ready for that yet. But it shows you the how and the why. And what is that example I'm talking about, Mr. President? Singapore decided that in order for us to be water resilient and independent, that they're going to use all of the water and waste in their system, what we would call toilet water, whatever, backed by science, and they had 3 centrifugal processes to clean it down to its last atom and core. I'm not into the science, so I can't get the language perhaps not correct. But it took 4 years of public education to change the mind, to transition into that mode. But now today, if you go to Singapore, and I don't know how many persons in the chamber have been to Singapore, but I can guarantee you, 98% of the water that you will drink comes from that process. And it is super clean. But why? One, they saw a challenge. They saw an outcome that they needed. We have to be independent and sufficient. And two, they realized that this transition will not be easy, but they did not cower, they did not fall to public opinion, they did not say, well, we are not going to do this. They said, you gave us a mandate to lead and to bring you to greener pastures, and we will do so. And that's the example I really want to leave on this one. This debate and this bill has gone through extensive public consultation. It has gone through significant toing and froing. But one of the legacies of this country, irrespective of administration now, has to be that we take the high road and the long-term view in the interest of not just today, but those born and those unborn and their collective good. And on that basis, Mr. President, I really, again, want to commend Senator Cummings and her ministry and her team, but equally all those in the private sector, public sector, NGOs who have lent their voice to this bill, and to really ask us as a nation to determine how do we go forward in the further building out of our independence and a new republic on these critical matters. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackman. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As I rise to close out debate on this bill, I first want to express appreciation to all, bar none, of the honorable members who have spoken and made contributions to this bill. I appreciate the robust discussion. I appreciate the inputs and the comments that have been made here today mirror the openness that we have taken to this discussion. When I opened this debate, Mr. President, I spoke about a process that started from 2019 and continued into 2020, 2022, and then 2023, leading to this process here today with all of the stakeholders. And so I can have no difficulty at all with persons today continuing to share their perspectives. Now, Mr. President, when I rose to introduce this bill, I deliberately took a position that I was going to focus on the merits of the bill, because despite what my newest colleague in the Honorable the Senate has said about the similarities between the 2013 bill and this one, the 2013 ELPA contained 37 sections. This bill has 78. So on the merits alone of the size of the bill, I agree with Senator Worrell's latter comment that it is a comprehensive revision of the original 2013 bill. And that there are at least 37 additional subsections of new additions and new innovations added to the bill over and above 2013. But I welcome the inputs nonetheless, Mr. President. I want to take the time, though, to make both responses to the queries that have been raised by the colleagues and to speak on matters of policy, which I did not deliberately deal with in the front of the bill because I wanted to spend the time going through the 78 sections of the bill and taking the opportunity to go through them for the benefit of the Senate as well as for the listening public. But I will do so, I had intended to do so in my closing. Now, there were a couple of comments made on a few things. Barbados's renewable energy policy dates back to 2019. There was a previous member of the Senate who sat on that side of the table who once took credit for creating the Barbados National Energy Policy and then the Barbados Labour Party when it came to government in 2018, putting a cover on it. So I suspect that what we are implementing now has spanned at least 2 administrations and is reflective of a commitment on behalf of both the Democratic Labour Party to renewable energy and the Barbados Labour Party for executing it. So there can be no question as to why we are pursuing a Barbados National Energy Policy that is dated 2019 all the way up to now. And I am surprised that I would hear or even have questioned the possibility of why we would be going in this direction. But Mr. President, I want to potentially speak about 2 elements. Mr. President, in the November 2023, economic report of the central bank. It is public information, and I'm going to quote from it for the record, Mr. President, and I'm comfortable making it a document of this honorable chamber. Mr. President, in 2023, November, the report of the Central Bank, where it spoke about our import position, it covered what this government spent from 2018, 2017, 2020, 2019, 2021, 2022, and then 2023 on fuel imports. The question on its own is not just a philosophical commitment to net zero, which I don't think anyone disagrees with. The question, Mr. President, is not just a philosophical issue about should we be carbon neutral. Those are all true things, Mr. President, but the question is, how does the government prioritize its expenditure in a way that protects and looks after its people? Mr. President, the report that I'm quoting from speaks specifically to what the government spent on fuel imports. Let's start with 2018. In fuels, Mr. President, this government spent $582.2 million in fuel imports. In 2019, $579 million in fuel imports. 2020, COVID year, $431.1 million in fuel imports. In 2021, $525.7 million in fuel imports. In 2022, Mr. President, 2022, for the entire year, the government had spent close to $1 billion, $913.9 million in fuel imports. By 2023, this was a November report, the government had spent $828.6 million in fuel imports. You could imagine that if we still had a quarter to go in the financial year, by the time the financial year ended in March of 2024, the total amount spent on fuel imports in this country could have possibly exceeded $1 billion. What does $1 billion do for education? What does $1 billion do for healthcare? What does $1 billion do to support consumer welfare, as was raised by Senator Walters? What does $1 billion do to help support people? So any person, anyone who questions why there is a renewable energy transition and why a government of Barbados would want to transition away from fossil fuels in favor of renewable energy only needs to consider the opportunity costs, as I have just listed them here, for fossil fuel imports and what we could be doing as a country with those resources. The hospital needs resources, Mr. President, but we are a small, open economy. And the government can't get all of its money from taxes because we can't overtax the population. In fact, this administration has reduced taxes to a historical low, and we have introduced measures to support those who fall under in the lowest income earning bracket to make sure that there's a reverse tax credit. So we can't tax people to be able to support our development agenda. We have introduced a large social welfare platform because we have ensured that people must matter, in particular those who are the most vulnerable. And so the government has to ensure that there are the productive sectors that help to generate the revenue, as well as the social sectors that protect people. And it has to be paid for, not in a utopian way, as if we try to take people around this notion that, oh, the government can do this, oh, we get more money from VAT. Yes, we get more money from VAT, but we had $600 million taken out of the bottom of the economy as a result of COVID year. You're still in recovery, and you still have the same expenses, if not an increased level of expenditure than you had before. When you have people walking up and down Oistins, Mr. President, after Barrel passed us, and we still have to repair the fishing harbor, Mr. President. Where does the money for those things come from? A government has to prioritize looking after people, and money therefore has to be spent that can be replaced from fossil fuel imports to support an energy transition. And I want to thank Senator Mallalieu for speaking in very clear terms, as did Senator Drake. She's not in her chair right now, but I want to also acknowledge their contributions. Mr. President, there's what we call a capital expenditure cost to new infrastructure. If I'm building a factory, as a matter of fact, let me say it differently. If I am buying a house, I have to go and face the bank, and I have to get a mortgage. that mortgage has to be repaid. Chances are the way the mortgage is going to be structured, I'm going to be paying interest first, and then I'm going to be paying the principal afterwards, because the bank wants to get its return. If I'm doing a commercial project, I have to rationalize what all of my capital expenditure costs are going to be. Then I'm going to rationalize how I'm going to recover that. And those people in here who are managers of large businesses, who are franchises around the globe would understand what I'm talking about a business having to make sure that they get a return on their investment. So yes, the upfront capital expenditure costs associated with renewable energy and the transition will initially have an impact on prices. We haven't guessed at that, Mr. President. We haven't guessed at it. With the support of the UN Special Envoy for Energy, we undertook last year, and we are preparing to finalize it now, an energy transition investment plan. That's how we know, Mr. President, that this country has the largest percentage of energy consumption in the transport sector. That's how we know, Mr. President, that there are 150,000 cars to transition. But you know, Mr. President, even as we speak about the partnership between the university and the West Indies and the partnership between industry and academia, I had the privilege a year ago of launching a project which was done in partnership with the Barbados National Oil Company, the National Petroleum Corporation, Mount Gay Distilleries, and Sermes of the University of the West Indies. We launched a project called Rum and Sargassum, Mr. President. Rum and Sargassum. We drew from rum waste, and we also pulled from sargassum, which is usually on our beaches at seasonal points of the year. A year later, Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, I was able to see the outputs of that project. Barbados launched what is, and I would have to say, because I've not seen it elsewhere in the world, and I'm being chased as I speak now to come to an event next week in another country to be able to speak about this innovation that Barbados has just launched. We launched the first electric car powered by fuel generated from rum waste and sargassum in this country, the first one. That car, Mr. President, if you pass by the Division of Energy on Country Road, any day you will see it charging downstairs in the Ministry of Energy, and I want to recognize SECRI, our regional institution of CARICOM. They then allowed their car to be branded and to be used as the first test car for this process. There is a discussion underway now at a policy level as well for us to rationalize how to scale that up so that in addition to the electric cars, we also have the opportunity to look at compressed natural gas, because we took MPC down to Trinidad. MPC then went with the transport operators and the UCALs and so on to look at what it would take to be able to retrofit existing cars, because everybody can't go and face the new dealers to buy a new car. So how do we help people to retrofit existing cars and make them more resilient and sustainable? And equally so, for rum and sargassum to be able to use a biofuel created by the physicists and the engineers in our own country, with our name attached to it, with the support of the European Union and the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. President. And we expect that under the umbrella of the Barbados National Oil Company, under my ministry, we will by next month have the first fueling station at Foursquare in St. Philip, Mr. President. Those are the innovations that are happening in this country. And why, Mr. President? Because there is, while there's a discussion around how much solar to put on the grid, and I agree 100% with Senator Drakes and Senator Worrell on the question of how quickly we transition, what do we do, how much is waiting in the queue. I believe Senator Walters raised it as well, and I don't have any difficulty. Mr. President, one, I'm proud of the innovations that the ministry has been able to see. While I am proud of the substantial work that my team has been doing and continues to do, I don't come here to beat my chest, neither do I come here to play politics with people. I don't come here for that. The reality of it, I'm not here to fool people that prices are going to go down by magic as though there's some theory out there that's going to take them down. I'm not here for that, as playing with people's emotions and creating false expectations, and I think we're better than that. Mr. President, I want to make it clear that my team, the team that I have the privilege and the honor of leading, a small team, in the Jamaican terms, I say little but Talawa, but you know what I mean. That team has undertaken what we call a multi-criteria analysis. How do we onboard solar? Because solar is inexpensive, it's easily accessible, people are very excited, and Barbadians had an oversupply because of an interest in solar very early in the game. That resulted in gridlock. The gridlock could potentially have been unlocked had we been keeping pace with regulatory oversight. So the Fair Trading Commission, it has a process that sits outside of the Ministry of Energy and the rate review process. And a lot of times we hear conversations only about the narrow context of what prices are going to be and so on. But the process before the FTC interrogates a range of additional things. It interrogates a change of behavior. Things like, do we have off-peak hours and off-peak rates? Am I washing laundry and turning on my washing machine? If I wash when everybody else is washing on a Saturday morning, when people are doing errands, as opposed to 11 o'clock in the night when you have lower usage and it's off-peak, what do I attract in terms of a rate? Those are the kinds of conversations that are meaningful that we need to begin to have with this country. And my ministry is committing to continuing to have those conversations. Equally so, and I raised the point, I agree 100% with Senator Worrell on the question of looking at different types. When I talk about us onboarding solar, when I talk about oversupply of solar, Mr. President, from as far back as 2013, we were not in government. The sector tells me that the question of storage was being raised from back then. But I agreed with Senator Nichols. Sometimes everything can't be done at once, and maybe at the time it was not necessarily the conversation that you could have, so I don't fault the then government for that. But we've had since 2013 to now to come to the understanding that as long as we continue to onboard more solar, which while inexpensive upfront, is highly intermittent, highly variable, it must be accompanied by storage, which has an added cost. What is my ministry therefore doing about that? My team has begun the process, and 2 weeks ago, the Cabinet of Barbados approved a project called Smarter. It is for us to be able to evolve into the development of firm baseload type projects and incentivizing those baseload type projects, because those baseload type projects would help to firm up the grid, yes, but it also reduces the constant perpetuation of solar, which would always have to be accompanied by storage, which will very much increase the cost. So we are sensitive to that. But as we talk about cost, Mr. President, let there be no doubt about it. This government engages with all of our partners on every aspect relating to this sector. But we don't need any individual Robin Hood on the outside, so-called Robin Hood on the outside there, to be able to make us think about people. That's not this government. We, with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. President, have just completed in July, which started since last year, September. It's an impact assessment on electricity costs. It's an assessment report. The report is not yet public, so I can't quote from it, but I can assure you that the Ministry of Energy and Business has undertaken an assessment of what the impact will be on consumers of this energy transition. We've done it in the Energy Transition Investment Plan, and yes, the timelines for 2030 are highly aggressive and therefore very expensive. The timelines for 2035, we have simulated what it would look like if we were to continue with a business as usual scenario. If we were to go for 2030, what it would look like for 2035. So when Senator Drake, Mr. President, says, do we know what 2035 looks like? The answer is yes. Because we've done the modeling, we've done the sensitivity analysis, we've gotten the engineering assessments, we've looked at what the grid modernization plan allows for, and we have worked with all of the stakeholders to be able to deliver on that. Senator Walters spoke in his presentation as well about the government having a smart energy program and so on. I want to point out, for the record, that Smart Energy Program, Smart Energy Fund, was launched on June 23rd, 2017. As government was not in power, we continue to implement it. It still continues to function, but it was launched in 2017. And however it was crafted at the time remains what is being done since then, with a few exceptions. And so the support for transitioning, as Senator Worrell then spoke, with regard to LED lighting and so on. That has all been done. But what we have gone further to do, Mr. President, is to assess between 2017 and 2024 what the impact has been on energy efficiency now. So what are the efficiency gains? What have been the savings as a result of the energy audits, transitioning from AC units to include inverter units, changing out to LED lights, even the street lights projects? All of the electric buses for the government of Barbados have been procured under that program. We're now doing additional procurement for other agencies as well. That is all under the Smart Energy Fund, and I am extremely confident that we will continue to evolve the fund in a way that helps to support people. Now, Mr. President, I want to clarify on the Energy Procurement Committee in this legislation for a reason. We are now engaged in the process of competitive bidding, developing a competitive bidding framework. And we had a press conference a few months ago with our international partners who were here with us, and they shared with us the development after all this time of the first battery energy storage system projects in Barbados. We've announced that we will go to market for 150 megawatts. Why have we put in 150 megawatts, Mr. President? Because we know that the Barbados Light and Power, the utility, the 15 megawatts that have been approved by them will simply stabilize the grid for what is there and those persons who are on curtailment presently. But we need to be able to get additional capacity on the grid. So we therefore need to have the accompanying storage. And we have modeled that all the way out, Mr. President, to 2026. So we know what that looks like. And between now and 2026, those base load projects, those biomass projects that I've just been describing, that smarter project, which is about developing a bioenergy economy, those things we expect to come into the mix and therefore allow for the further expansion of the grid without those highly vulnerable, variable forms of renewable energy. So those are the things that are going to be there, Mr. President, and we expect that by October next month, we will launch the first procurement. But this is what is important. The reason, Mr. President, why the procurement committee does not fall under the strict ambit of the existing procurement legislation is because if you consider all of the renewable energy projects across the country, Mr. President, they're all private sector owned. They're all owned by private parties. They're all owned either by the utility, they're owned by an independent power producer, they're not owned by the government. So the electrical committee is not procuring goods for the government. It is the facilitator of the procurement process. And this part of the legislation, Mr. President, is drawn from Jamaica's legislation. We're using the Jamaica model. Jamaica has both an Office of Utility Regulation and the Generation Procurement Entity. What we have done is we've looked at the Jamaica legislation with the assistance and the guidance of Sir David Simmons. We have created the equivalent components of what Jamaica has done to effectively ensure that the government, while not procuring goods for itself, is facilitating that entity. And it is a reason why the Chief Procurement Officer, the Fair Trading Commission, and all of those things have been incorporated in the structure. The government will not own the assets. What I can also say to Senator Worrell, through you, Mr. President, is that the transparency that has been called for is agreed. What we have done with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. President, and Deloitte out of Spain, has been the development of a price market analysis and a price capping mechanism, which tells us these are the prices globally for these pieces of battery, this technology, and this is how it can be procured under these prices. And anything above that, then you know is out of the scope. All of that, Mr. President, we expect to be in a position to publish, won't keep it to ourselves, to publish as part of the procurement process in October. Mr. President, we sometimes don't sleep at night. We have gone into the weeds, literally in the weeds on this. And we have ensured that from an impact assessment on what it will look like to consumers, that the government is always in a position to make decisions that will be in the best interest of the people of Barbados. Now, there was an important point that was raised by Senator Drakes about ensuring sustainability and ensuring that there's a holistic approach in terms of the design of the system. I give the commitment that all that I have just been describing is very much a part of the design work. We know that the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan is a roadmap. That is a 3-year plan. The grid modernization plan, that is also going to take us a little bit further. We know that there's supposed to be, and I haven't shared it here, an energy storage roadmap, which is in its final stages of development, which is going to map out what we do next and in what quantum. We know what types of technology are already commercially available. Lithium ion is what we're going to the market for. But we also know that in our IRRP, we have pump hydro, which is a possibility, which will give us a longer range of energy storage without having to go to the market for batteries. So all of that work is there in the Ministry of Energy, and I give you the assurance that that holistic approach is very much covered in our policy, which is separate and apart from the legislation which creates the regulatory framework. Now, the last thing that I want to say here, Mr. President, is specific to the tariff structure. The feed-in tariffs, there's some feed-in tariffs that were issued from as far back as 2013, 2016, and onward. And those early movers were able to get a tariff that was quite highly incentivized because they were the first movers. That usually happens. And those tariffs, Mr. President, have contributed towards the costings that Senator Drake spoke about, 2013, 2016 era tariffs. And they're for 25 years. So we're locked in to what that looks like, Mr. President, which is the reason why the FTC in June of 2023 said the next stage for a country like Barbados is to move away from the artificial setting of feed-in tariff regimes and to now introduce competitive bidding. That is why it is in the legislation, because it did not exist before. We had only the feed-in tariff regime, and that is most certainly an innovation that needed to be incorporated. But even then, Mr. President, we have respected the relevance of the Utilities Regulation Act, the Fair Trading Commission Act, and the Fair Trading Commission continues to take primacy in the identification of that process and in anchoring the procurement committee. And I want to give the assurance again that when we think about how this is all being implemented, that the government maintains at the center of its consideration how it all is going to impact the consumers. So, Mr. President, I hope, and I have tried to answer as many of the questions as I can recall or as I have taken note of. The GEED, I believe Senator Malalou spoke about whether or not the GEED is going to be able to have the necessary personnel and the support to be able to deliver on that. We have even added further, Mr. President, we have added to the electrical inspectors to create that mechanism. And so what I can say is that we are having difficulty at this point recruiting persons for these roles, simply because the remuneration scales at government, this is a generation, Mr. President, that when I joined the public service, and even when I was invited back into the public service, Mr. President, you accepted that if you're coming into the public sector for money, you're coming in the wrong place. But it's a generation now that looks for equivalence between rates of return on salaries in the private sector and what they want to earn in the public sector. And we're not always getting the skills that we need in the public sector, but we are recruiting as we speak, Mr. President. And so I want to thank, as I close, all of the colleagues for their comments. I want to give the commitment that we will continue to engage as we have done so far. This process, over the course of 2019, 2020, and all of the stakeholders that I outlined in my initial comments, has been exhaustive. And I want to thank them and take the opportunity publicly to thank every single one of the stakeholders who have submitted hundreds of comments. Hundreds of comments. And we will continue, as I mentioned before in my opening, in a regulatory sandbox to welcome their inputs as the technology and therefore the regulatory regime continues to evolve. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. The question is that this bill, the Electricity Supply Bill 2024, be read a second time. The Lord's honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The next, the ayes have it. So, before we go to committee, we have to revert to motions related to matters of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are required today to appoint a temporary acting chair of committees. And Deputy President, and I beg to move that Senator the Honorable Lindell Nurse be nominated as today's Deputy President.
The question is that Senator the Honorable Lindell Nurse, the elected Deputy President for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it. Thank you, Senator Nurse, for agreeing to serve. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into a committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Senate is now in committee.
Mr. Chairman, permission to call the bill in parts.
Permission granted.
I guess so. Part 1, clauses 1 through 4.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 through 4 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 to 4 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 5 through 8.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 5 through 8 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 5 to 8 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 9 through 20.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 9 through 20 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 9 to 20 stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 21 through 23.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 21 through 23 do now stand part.
Part, will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, just for the record, could you just go over that? Because you would have missed the audio of the first.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 21 to 23 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 24 through 34.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 24 through 34 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 24 to 34 do stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 35 through 48.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 6, clauses 35 through 48 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 6, clauses 35 to 48 do stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 49 through 51.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 7, clauses 49 through 51 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 7, clauses 49 to 51 do stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 52 through 54.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 8, clauses 52 through 54 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 8, clauses 52 to 54 do stand part. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 55 and 56.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 9, clauses 55 and 56 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 9, clauses 55 and 56 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 57 through 62.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 10, clauses 57 through 62 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 10, clauses 57 to 62 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 11, clauses 63 to 65.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 11, clauses 63 to 65 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 11, clauses 63 to 65 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 12, clause 66.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 12, clause 66 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 12, clause 66 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 13, clauses 67 through 79.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 13, clauses 67 through 79 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 13, clauses 67 to 79 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
First schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is?
Page 63. 63.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move an amendment to the first schedule, Section 1, subsection 4, where it reads the chief town planner. This really should be the director of planning. I think the exact language is the director of planning and development.
The question is that the first schedule be amended to read as follows. Section 1, subsection 4.
Mr. Chairman, is ready paragraph 1A4. The correct term is paragraph 1A4.
Paragraph 1A4 would now read as follows: the Director of Planning and Development. The question is that this first schedule be, as amended, be now the schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Third schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Fourth schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Electricity Supply Act of 2024. As amended.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Electricity Supply Act 2024. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Mr. President, reports from recommittal of reports from select committees.
Senator Cummins. She had it. Honourable Senators, in relation to the Committee of Selection, with the change of with the Minister of Office of Senator Watson, is a new appointment to be made to that vacancy arose in the Committee of Selection. The proposal is for Senator Andre Worrell to be appointed a member of the Selection Committee to fill that vacancy. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Senator Worrell, thank you. You are now a member of the Committee of Selection. Secondly, the Committee of Selection held a meeting today, and there is a report. Again, with the change of senators, a number of vacancies arose. In terms of procedure, recognize that the we needed to appoint Senator Worrell first of all, but we also wanted to expedite the appointment. So we could consult with Senator Worrell. He is fully aware and supports the proposals that are made. Accordingly, those committees on which Senator Watson sat will now be Senator Worrell, with the exception of one change. That would be the Committee on Social Sector and Environment, that the membership of Senator Walters be withdrawn in favor of Senator Worrell, and that Senator Walters instead be nominated to serve on the Committee of Economic and Productive Sectors. Other than that, then, just to be clear, the nominations to fill the vacancies would find that Senator Worrell will be nominated to serve on the Management Commission of Parliament, on the Standing Orders Committee, the Committee of Privileges, the Library Committee, Public Accounts Committee. And that would pretty much constitute the proposals which form the basis of the report and the meeting of the Standing Orders Committee, as indicated, have been done in full consultation with Senator Worrell. Could I have a motion for the adoption of the report, please?
I beg to move the adoption of the report as outlined by His Honor the President.
And just to remind in terms of procedure, if the Senate gives its concurrence for the adoption of the report, that gives effect to the committee appointments, and all vacancies have been filled. I see the clerk approaching. Let me, as anyways, presiding officer freezes when clerk approaches. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. The question is that the report of the selection committee be adopted. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it. The report is adopted and the committee changes have been effected. And just for procedural completeness, to let you know that the usual suitable note will be sent to the Honorable the House of Assembly, because the committees on social sector and environment and economic and productive sectors are joint select committees, and therefore, and so is the Management Commission. So any of the committees that are joint select committees, so the appropriate notification will be sent to the Honorable the House of Assembly concerning our appointments. The question is that I do send a suitable note to the Honorable the House as outlined. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Note will be sent. That you're working hard, boy. That's his. That's yours, Ahmed. Okay, who is this? Deputy Clerk. Deputy, please. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, again, I want to express my appreciation to all the honorable senators for today, and this being the end of government business for the day, I beg to move that the Senate do be adjourned sine die.
The question is that this sitting of the Senate be adjourned sine die. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it. Before I gavel, I just want to thank everyone for their full active debate today. I know it is Friday. It is that hour at which we tend to be engaged in other activities of whatever kind. And I really want to thank you for your active engagement and productive activity this afternoon. I wish everyone a very pleasant weekend. Once again, Senator Worrell, welcome, and thank you for your participation. The Senate stands adjourned.